Take a look at this. A non-profit group called the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and YouGov asked 23,000 Americans whether they would rather live in a capitalist or socialist country. And here's the results. 59% said they prefer capitalism, with 34% preferring a socialist nation, as you would perhaps expect. But of the millennials in the survey, the majority said they would prefer to be in either a socialist, communist, or even a fascist country. The survey also suggests 7 in 10 Americans don't fully understand what communism is or confuse it with socialism.
That's where socialism and communism come into play. According to Marx, socialism is a precursor to communism and the next logical step after capitalism. In socialism, a democratic state controls the means of production, rather than having private companies hold ownership. Instead of competing with each other as in a capitalist society, socialism has workers contribute as much as they can to the greater good, and then they all share equally in that good. Variations of this idea are already popular within capitalist societies in the form of universal healthcare or social services like fire departments and schools funded by taxes. While the use of these services is unequal, everyone is equally responsible for contributing to them based on their ability or level of income. So that's socialism. But once the state controls all the means of production, the next step is total collective ownership, not just of production, but all aspects of society and economy, including private property. The intention of abolishing private property is a classless, moneyless, and stateless society, where everyone works towards the same collective goal of being healthy, happy, and free. Everybody does what they can to contribute and takes only what they need in return. As I said before, there are no true communist countries, and there never have been. Every so-called communist country is actually a socialist country, with the state controlling employment and economy to some degree. Even the widely referred to Communist Russia was actually called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In short, socialism and communism are not altogether different. Rather, most schools of economics consider socialism to be a precursor to communism once the state has enough control over society and economy. But this total control is a major reason that socialist countries struggle to reach this ideal. Corruption is rampant in countries like the former USSR, Venezuela, Vietnam, and North Korea, largely due to people in power abusing that power instead of using it to help the society they control, and refusing to give up that power to the people.
How would you define socialism?
I mean, honestly, that definition gets thrown around a lot.
How would you view what socialism is, though?
To be quite honest, I don't know.
It could really benefit our country in the future.
I think it's a good idea.
Trying to spread the wealth is definitely a good thing in America, and it's definitely a thing that's needed.
And Kevin, before you go, for the people who love socialism but don't know what socialism is, before you go, what is it?
I would define it as the government collectivizing means of production and taking hold of the economy and deciding who the winners and losers are.
What do you make of this survey?
There's no idea so bonehead stupid that you can't get at least 22% of the millennial crowd to believe in it. And that's what this is. These numbers are pretty ridiculous, and they're based on a lot of people talking about things they don't know about. Let me tell you about communism in 2 short sentences. Communism is not love. Communism is a hammer which we use to crush the enemy. That was Mao Zedong. Now, you want to be free, millennials? Well, it's true that liberty is precious. In fact, it's so precious that it must be rationed. That was Vladimir Lenin.
The Labour Party here is still trying to blow life into those old embers. Imagine a Labour canvasser talking on the doorstep to those East German families when they settled in on freedom's side of the wall. You want to keep more of the money you earn? I'm afraid that's very selfish. We shall want to tax that away. You want to own shares in your firm? We can't have that. The state has to own your firm. You want to choose where to send your children to school? That's very divisive. You'll send your child where we tell you. Mr. President, the trouble with Labour is that they're just not at home with freedom. Socialists don't like ordinary people choosing, for they might not choose socialism.
You know, so Wow, I'm just astonished by this. But remember, an idea is not responsible for the people who believe in it. And
right. So, Craig,
that's, I think,
look,
what we have going on here.
You reported from the USSR while it was still under communist rule. What would people there at that time have said if you told them in 2017 a majority of young Americans want to be more like you rather than, freewheeling capitalists?
Well, they would have howled because during my 10 years there, everyone who had any sense was trying to get out of the place. This is really frightening. And Stalin lovers, listen, let me tell you, one of Uncle Joe's favorite quotes, death is the solution to all problems. No man, no problem. That's a direct quote from Stalin. And it goes on and on and on. I just think a lot of young Americans don't take history, they don't read, they believe this nonsense that flows across their Twitter feeds and Facebook pages, and this is what happens.
With business people, with Wall Street, you're a very polarizing figure.
Look, I get that there are a lot of folks who like having the power and the riches they have. They like being able to tweak their little pinky, and the United States government does just what they want. They like being able to get regulations rolled back or not enforced. I totally get that. And I get that I push hard against that I may be a threat to them on that.
People here are pretty upset and pretty sad for because of the election. I certainly find this election deeply offensive, and I know many of you do too.
But my view on that is, don't call me the polarizing figure. They're the ones who want to take advantage of this country. They're the ones who want to cheat. They're the ones who want to say that their personal wealth, their power is more important than building an America that works for everyone.
And YouTube's moved to hit popular users before, conservative users especially.
While President Trump is draining the swamp, Diamond and Silk is going to be exposing the swamp.
There are some at Google who don't agree with the company's liberal leanings. James Damore, a conservative engineer, wrote a memo, just a memo, to highlight potential bias in Google's policy. And he was fired for
Senator
it.
Elizabeth Warren sitting down with Jim Cramer on Mad Money tonight, discussing a bill she's just introduced, the Accountable Capitalism Act. How does she plan to get more accountability into capitalism?
Let's get these corporations to charter federally, the ones that have more than $1 billion of sales every year. And let's have a couple of features. First one, let's put some employees on the board. Second one, let's change the compensation structure for the CEOs to say that the CEOs will not be permitted to juice the price, and then once they juice the price, make a quick sale, make $1 bazillion, and keep emphasizing the incentives. That's what we've got now for short-termism. Want to get rid of that.
Let's bring in Jeffrey Myron. He's Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Economics at Harvard University and a Director of Economic Studies at the Cato Institute. Good to have you here, Mr. Myron.
Nice to be here.
I'm pleased to see there are defenders of the free markets at Harvard. I was getting worried there, so good to have you on. What do you think?
There are a few of us.
What do you think of Elizabeth Warren's proposal to, quote, save capitalism?
I think, unfortunately, it is seriously misguided. I think it will help to destroy capitalism. The crucial thing is that this new federal charter that most corporations would have to apply for and have to obey certain rules about compensation, about employee representatives on the board, will create a whole set of new rules that the federal government will enforce. Those rules will not be clean, explicit, or simple. They'll be messy, they'll be complicated. Huge ability for companies to evade and avoid, and for the government to enforce those rules in a way that protects those who are less honest, protects those who are politically connected. It's just a recipe for more crony capitalism, not for more productive capitalism.
But you know, when she's trying to solve income inequality,
which has been established is growing. So how do you solve that?
Well, I think it's still an open question as to whether policy should be trying to reduce income inequality. There are many reasons for income inequality. Many of them suggest we should try to reduce it. All sorts of government policies that create more inequality, of course, don't make sense or undesirable. But inequality that happens via the free market is not necessarily undesirable. It is what it is.
Give way to the honourable gentleman.
There is no doubt that the Prime Minister has in many ways achieved substantial success in the economy. There is one statistic that I understand is not, however, challengeable, and that is that over her 11 years, the gap between the richest 10% and the poorest 10% in this country has widened substantially.
That's right.
How can she say at the end of her chapter of British politics that she can justify many people in a constituency such as mine being relatively much poorer off, much less well housed, and much less well provided than it was in 1979? Surely she accepts that is not a record that she or any Prime Minister can be proud of.
Mr. Speaker, all levels of income are better off than they were in 1979. But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And what a policy! Yes, he would rather have the poor poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That is the Liberal policy. Yes, it came out. He didn't intend it to, but he did. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm extremely grateful. The Prime Minister is aware that I detest every single one of her domestic policies and have never hid that.
And I think that the honourable gentleman knows that I have the same contempt for his socialist policies as the people of East Europe who have experienced it have it for theirs. I think I must have hit the right nail on the head when I pointed out that the logic of those policies are they'd rather have the poor poorer. Once they start to talk about the gap, they'd rather the gap were that. Down here. That. Not that. But that. So long as the gap is smaller, they'd rather have the poor poorer. You do not create wealth and opportunity that way. You do not create a property-owning democracy that way.
Yourself a democratic socialist. How can any kind of socialist win a general election in the United States?
Well, we're going to win because first we're going to explain what democratic socialism is. And what democratic socialism is about is saying that it is immoral and wrong that the top 1/10 of 1% in this country own almost 90%, own almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%.
Democratic socialism. It's not the same as socialism because it's democratic, right? Or something, right? People are buying that. People buy that now, right? Apparently. As though adding the word democratic in front of a word changes what it means. Just because we toss something to a vote doesn't change what that something is, nor does it alter whether that something is inherently good or bad. Couple of examples, because I know you'll ask. Hamas was democratically elected as the government in Gaza, despite the fact that the destruction of not only Israel, but the eradication of all Jews is in their official charter. Robert Mugabe, or Bobby Mugabe if you prefer, was democratically elected by a loving majority in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, how's that working out? Venezuela? Well, Hugo Chavez, noted personal favorite and friend of Sean Penn, to whom he constantly pointed as being unfairly characterized as a dictator when in fact he was democratically elected as a socialist. Well, how'd that work out for Venezuela? Well, it's now on the brink of collapse, despite it being one of the most resource-rich nations in the entire world. Basic things like eggs, milk, flour, and toilet paper are either too expensive for the average Venezuelan or simply out of stock. Out of stock, mind you, democratically. A successful model for a viable economy in today's global market? Incorrect. The fact is that over time, the greatest enemy of socialism is reality. The reality that human nature will invariably pull certain people toward individualism and success and others toward laziness and collectivism. The tension between the makers and the takers always leads to socialism's inevitable collapse. But I know that I can give you examples of failed socialist economies until I'm blue in the face, and you won't care. Because at least socialism is inherently more morally altruistic than the evil, greedy, capitalist warmongering seen in the West. Greed? What's more greedy than wanting to take from someone else something that you haven't earned? Unlike capitalism, free enterprise, which can only occur truly through voluntary transaction, socialism can only occur at gunpoint. That's what it comes down to. If you don't pay your taxes, once you get through the IRS and the auditing and the lawyers and the PR stunts, people make you give the government your money, an increasing amount of your money, the more successful you are, or they send in scary men with guns to take you away. Now, so long as the people having their stuff taken away at gunpoint are in the minority, and the majority feels that they'll get to benefit from more said taken stuff, you'll always be able to win that decision through a popular vote and claim the moral high ground through democracy. Putting the word democratic in front of your socialism doesn't make it any inherently more moral nor less violent. Did you get that? American wannabe socialists also.
Free. And it's not just government spending. Much more important even than government spending is government regulation. Government regulation makes it almost impossible to innovate. All innovation today is happening in areas that are not regulated. Luckily, the federal government has not decided to regulate this, because if it did, it wouldn't look like this. It wouldn't be this beautiful machine. Indeed, if a government committee made one of these, I'll leave it to your imagination what it would look like. And you all know it, whether you're leftist or right, you all know a government committee would never make anything as beautiful as this. All of you know that. But yet, you want the government to make this. You do, because that's the implication of the policies many of you are advocating.
When you're talking about everyone benefiting, when, for example, we buy Harry Potter, etc., J.K. Rowling benefits, we benefit.
Yeah.
All those examples were in MEDCs, in countries with...
Good, so the China question.
In the West.
Cool.
Well, I was wondering what your opinion is then when it affects another part, a poor part of the world, such as Africa. I mean, the money, Western companies, I mean, they are not, their time, they don't have the choice of labour a lot of the time. Their job is not, like the amount they work is not correlative to how much money they get and how much they need.
How do you get to make that decision for them? You sit here in Europe in your cushy middle class chairs. I'm serious about this. And you want to judge the African, or let's take the Chinese, because that's why, you know, in Apple, or the Indonesian so-called sweatshop or whatever. And you want to tell me that $2 a day is not a dramatic improvement in their life? It is. And there's no way for them to get to that point to be as rich as you are unless they go through that phase. And if you deny them the ability to make $2 a day by charging by insisting the companies pay $4, and therefore they withdraw completely from the market. Because you know what? I'm not paying $600 for this. I'll pay $300. And if I stop buying this, who suffers, right? And his alternative is to go back to the farm. And you know what they did in the farms? 40 years ago, when the Chinese were all producing agriculture, they were dying of starvation. 40 to 60 million Chinese died of starvation under Mao. Suddenly, you've given them opportunity to actually attain middle classhood, to learn a skill, to have a profession, to make money, to make themselves into something. And by the way, the Chinese never complain about how much they're being paid. You guys complain. We complain in the West. Because yes, to our middle class comfy lives, that seems ridiculous. But that's because you've never lived in real poverty. Nobody in England has lived in real poverty the way the Chinese and the Africans and the Indonesians live. Over the last 30 years, 1 billion, that's with a B, people have come out of poverty in Asia. Why? Because of capitalism, not because of foreign aid. Foreign aid doesn't help anybody, except the dictators who put them in the Swiss bank accounts. What helps poor countries is freedom. You give them the rule of law. You give them property rights. If you're interested in property rights and how it helps poor people, read Capital Ideas by Hernando de Soto, a Peruvian economist, a brilliant economist. You give them property, you give them capital, you give them a job. That's how you create wealth. Now, I know some people have said, all you guys care about is the rich. Somebody said, what you care about is the rich deserve it. You know what? I don't care about the rich. They don't need taking care of, right? They're doing great. I care about the poor. I care about the poor. And the only system in human history, to help the poor, to help ambitious poor people rise out of poverty and become rich, has been capitalism. Free markets are the only cure for poverty. The only way in which you become rich so you don't have to have poor people. There's no other way to do it. When we tried socialism, we get poverty. We get a return, a deterioration. We get a destruction of wealth, not a creation of wealth. So you want people to, you care about the poor and the middle class? I also care about the rich, because I think that they are villainized for, which is unbelievably unjust. But I care about young people who I want to maximize their opportunities, and I know that the only way to maximize people's opportunities is to give economic freedom to the world.